All right. So, thank you all once again for joining us this evening. I'm really excited for this evening's program. Really appreciate you guys taking some time to spend it with us here at Chicago Ornithological Society. I hope everybody is staying both cool and smoke in the lung free. And so, with that said, I would love to really get us going here on this evening's episode of Birds and Bites, our virtual program series. I feel like it's weirdly poetic. This was born out of COVID times when we were all trying to protect our lungs, and now here we are in, wildfire times trying to protect our lungs. So it really serves a lot of great purposes, but the best ones of all being able to connect us as birders virtually when we can't be together physically, and also bring guests from elsewhere who are outside of the region to come share their bird knowledge with us, which we'll get to in a minute. As you guys may already be familiar with joining us here, this is part of a larger series specific to this year, our Year of the Nighthawk celebrations, our Chicago Nighthawk project run by Chicago Ornithological Society. It is now 5 years old, and so we decided to go big this year with a whole series of programs and events related to these awesome birds. If you haven't had a chance to join some of the programs that have already happened, there are recordings and or write-ups on the COS website, and we have a few more coming up as well through the course of the year. We're very excited to bring on our guest here, who has been doing an extensive project of their own focused on nighthawks in the Northeast U.S. and some of the work that they've done and some of the things that they're seeing in the populations in their region. So before I hand it off, I just want to remind everybody, please go ahead and stay muted for the duration of the program. We don't, again, want to have weird sounds in the backgrounds or awkward side conversations or just, anything that could be distracting the speakers, making it hard for other folks here to hear. Um, this is not like a classroom. You're obviously welcome to get up and get a drink, get some extra food, hang out, make yourself comfortable. And at the end of the day, we will, if you miss any part of this will be recorded and this will end up on our YouTube channel probably later today. If you guys have any questions for our speaker here today, feel free to go ahead and put them in the chat so you don't forget or she can see them. We will answer those questions after the main presentation, and we'll get to those questions afterwards. But with that said, I think that's all that I need to say. You didn't come here to listen to me yak all day. I'll put some important links in the chat, but otherwise, I would love to hand it over and give a warm welcome to our speaker today, Lindsay Herlihy.
Thanks so much, Edward. I'm very happy to be here with you all this evening. And before I get too far ahead of myself, per the icebreaker, our highlight moment, if you will, for breeding birds this summer. I've got a nighthawk one for you, actually. I was just out in a large tract of pine barrens habitat last evening and found evidence of a nighthawk nest. Actually, literally found hatched eggshells on the ground. And we think we caught sight of the juvenile taking flight, which was really special and so encouraging. And you'll understand a little bit more why that's so encouraging as the talk proceeds. So let me share my screen and we can get this party fully started. So folks, again, welcome this evening. My name is Lindsay Herlihy. I am a biologist with New Hampshire Audubon. True to its name, I am in fact located in New Hampshire. And I'm here tonight to join your year-long celebration of the wonderful goatsucker family, Nighthawks in particular, to share a little bit about what we have been learning up here in New Hampshire about our common nighthawk populations. So I'm sure that many of you are experienced birders and you may already be at least somewhat familiar with common nighthawks, but if that is not the case, I wanted to give you a quick introduction. Contrary to their name, common nighthawks are not actually hawks, nor are they closely related to any raptor. But they are active at night, so at least some part of their name is at least kind of accurate. So rather than being related to raptors, common nighthawks are members of the bird family Caprimulgidae, often referred to collectively as caprimulgids. And that Latin family name translates roughly to milker of goats or goatsucker. And that unusual name actually stems from the myth that caprimulgids use their very wide, cavernous mouth with that tiny little external beak to suckle from nanny goats. but I assure you that that is not actually the purpose of their unique mouth shape. Rather, common nighthawks are a part of an ecological group called aerial insectivores, which means that they feed on flying insects while they themselves are also in flight. And that wide mouth helps them to gulp down those insects and funnel them the right way down their gullet. Common nighthawks have a very unique silhouette. Long, narrow, pointed wings and a long, slightly forked tail. And all of that wing surface area also facilitates their effectiveness as an aerial insectivore. Their plumage is very cryptic. That mottled brown, black, and buff makes for excellent camouflage while they are perched, which is often along a tree branch or directly on the ground. Size-wise, common nighthawks are comparably sized to mourning doves, roughly 9 inches long from bill to tail tip, but their wingspan is quite large, proportionate to their body size, more analogous to that of a blue jay. For those of you who have not seen a common nighthawk, they also have a variety of useful field marks, and they are slightly sexually dimorphic, meaning that the males and females do have slightly different appearances that can be a little bit subtle until you know what to look for. Both males and females have those distinctive white patches near the ends of their primary flight feathers. And those are particularly eye-catching while they're in flight, even when it is starting to get a bit dim out, a little after sunset. However, common nighthawk males have a very white patch on their throat that you can often see when they soar or flap right over you. And they have some relatively subtle but very much present white spots in their tail as well. In contrast, females have a far reduced throat patch that is buff rather than bright white, so there's much less contrast, and they do not have those white bars in their tail. As I alluded to, these birds are active at night, but they are considered to be crepuscular rather than truly nocturnal. That means that they are most active at dusk and dawn. And their habitat that they rely on needs to be very open. So they prefer things like recently burned or artificially thinned forests, scrubland, rocky outcrops, and they also thrive in some human-created habitat, such as agricultural land and certain urban environments. And as mentioned, they feed on flying insects, and these can include things like winged ants, which they are particularly fond of during fall migration, flying beetles, and even some large moths, including the largest in North America, the saturnid or large silk moths. Here are some examples of common nighthawk habitat, particularly focused on the ones that we find up here in the Northeast. So they need that open area. So examples include pine barrens, which is the image on the far left, those rocky outcrops or mountaintops, as long as they are not too heavily disturbed by people. That's the middle image. And there are some urban areas that can support them during the breeding season as well. And we'll focus a little bit more on those later in this presentation. Common nighthawks are widespread throughout North America and parts of Central America during the breeding season. And they are highly migratory, traveling several thousand miles annually during their spring and fall migration. And during fall migration in particular, they will frequently migrate in large, loose flocks, which are very, very eye-catching and truly is an amazing spectacle to watch if you are privileged enough to be in an area along their migratory routes. And they do also hunt as they migrate. So in those loose flocks, they may seem like they're milling around somewhat aimlessly, but they are gradually trending toward the south if we're talking about fall migration. For their nesting habitat, they prefer, again, these open areas, gravel beaches, open woodlands. And in those areas, they do not build a distinctive nest. They lay their eggs directly on the ground and rely heavily on the camouflage from the pattern of the eggshells and the cryptic coloration of the female while she's incubating to escape the notice of predators. As far as parental care goes, typically incubation is completed by the female only. However, both parents provision the young by regurgitating insects into their mouth. Yum. And the male will also help with defense of the nest area and keeping a lookout for predators. Now, I mentioned that nighthawks are cryptically colored. So I assure you that there is, in fact, a nighthawk in this photo. Take a second, search around, and see if you can find her. Oh, I just gave it away. It is a female, and she is incubating eggs. If you haven't spotted her yet, there she is. And a little zoomed in, you can see her silhouette just a little bit better, but darn, does that cryptic coloration do wonders to keep her hidden. It can be quite startling if you're wandering around not realizing that there's a nighthawk there, only to have them flush out from practically underneath your feet. The chicks are also very well camouflaged. Once they dry out after hatching, their fluffy little natal down is modeled to help them blend in with either the leaf litter or the gravel that their eggs were laid upon. And there is a close-up of one of those chicks. This one is just a couple days old when these photos were taken. And those eggs are also very cryptically colored. I call this picture boss mode as far as trying to find the common nighthawk eggs. While I've got you all here, the reason that we discovered the very first confirmed nighthawk nest in the early 2000s up here in New Hampshire is because I almost stepped on the eggs. I didn't. They were safe, they were fine, and the chick fledged successfully, which was wonderful, but those eggs are really hard to spot by design as a mechanism to try to escape predation. Now, the breeding behavior of common nighthawks is a major focus of mine. Males are extremely territorial and have some spectacular displays to defend their territory and attract a mate. And this largely involves vocalizing, which we sometimes call painting, while they circle over the center part of their territory. If they have rivals bordering their territory, they may sometimes trend toward one direction of the territory or another in order to essentially warn off that male and remind him of where that territory boundary is. And in addition to that, the males perform a truly incredible behavior called booming, wherein they fly several hundred feet off the ground, go into a very steep dive, and at the bottom of their dive, they open their wings just enough to let air rush through their primary feathers, and it makes a distinctive, surprisingly loud booming noise, which is where the name of the behavior comes from. And I have a video so that you can hear exactly what that's like. Hopefully the audio will work. Can you hear him painting? If so, there will be a brief pause, and there was his boom. truly spectacular, and sometimes they will go deep into the night doing this behavior at the height of the breeding season. In contrast, the females are very cryptic and secretive, which makes sense since they're the primary caretakers, especially during the incubation phase of their breeding season. So, as a part of this secretiveness, they do not vocalize very much. They are very sneaky when they come back to the nest area to provision the young. And that sneakiness lasts until you get just a little too close to her nest, at which point she will do a very fascinating and entertaining, not gonna lie, distraction display that looks like this. So she will sit on the ground and flop around as if her wings are broken, hoping to lure the predator away from her nest. Apologies for letting it go too long so that the other voice kicked in. So this is great. Common nighthawks are amazing. So what is Project Nighthawk? We are a statewide research initiative in New Hampshire, coordinated by New Hampshire Audubon. And our goal is to conserve common nighthawks by learning as much as we can about their breeding behavior, identify and monitor the breeding sites that they maintain in the state of New Hampshire. We record their annual breeding results, and at one point in this project, we also have tested the potential to help restore urban nesting habitat for common nighthawks with gravel nest patches. Now, in my humble opinion, it is worth studying common nighthawks solely because they are incredible birds that play an important ecological role of controlling insect populations. But in addition to that, because of especially their crepuscular nature, they're very poorly understood. And unfortunately, they've been in a sharp range-wide decline in their populations since the mid-1900s. Some of the risks that are thought to be contributing to this decline include habitat loss, pesticide use, weather pattern changes, and a declining food supply. Now, it's important to note here that common nighthawk populations are considered threatened across all of Canada, but they are technically considered secure in the US according to NatureServe. But there are some parts of the United States where their decline is sharp enough and noticeable enough that they are considered threatened or even state endangered. And those states include much of the Northeast: Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Delaware. So this graph shows data from breeding bird surveys, and that shows a clear, steady decline in common nighthawk populations across the entire US, although it is most concerning in the Northeast. In the Northeast, and in New Hampshire specifically, we classify common nighthawks as state endangered. And we estimate that there has been a 70% population decline in the Northeast since the mid-1960s until early 2020s. And many of the urban areas where common nighthawks used to be frequently observed, they just aren't there anymore. And they're largely restricted, especially during the breeding season, to the Concord area, which is in the kind of central southern part of the state, that red dot that you see. A couple of spots near the Connecticut River Valley, although they unfortunately have been vanishing from there very rapidly in the past couple of years. And they have a slightly larger stronghold in the Ossipee Pine Barrens region, which is the larger red area on the map of New Hampshire in kind of the top left part before the state gets very, very narrow. Unfortunately, we don't have a solid understanding of exactly why common nighthawks are declining so steeply, and in particular, why they're declining more rapidly in the Northeast United States compared to the rest of the country. But some factors that we have identified might include habitat loss, both in their breeding range and in their non-breeding range, pesticide use, which can reduce their food supply, prey declines due to other factors, including things like climate change and shifting phenology that is attributed to climate change as well, increased predation now that their populations are more isolated in some parts of the Northeast, and some increased hazards that they may encounter during migration, such as increased urbanization that might be limiting some of their stopover areas, and wind turbines and tall buildings that can contribute to death by window strikes. Now, in New Hampshire specifically, we have a rather unique situation. The distribution of common nighthawks in pre-colonial New Hampshire is unknown. But given that the majority of the state at that time was heavily forested, we can hypothesize that their range was likely limited to those rocky outcroppings, such as those that we have a lot of in the White Mountains, open areas of forest habitat, including pine barrens, and others that may have experienced a recent burn, either naturally created or done by indigenous peoples who practice controlled burns. We can also hypothesize that land clearing by the European colonists for agriculture likely resulted in an expansion of the common nighthawk range into New Hampshire. But now that a lot of that farmland is returning to forest, we can further hypothesize that reforestation of a lot of this post-colonial range expansion is now contracting and is likely playing a role in at least part of the declines that we are seeing in New England. But that doesn't explain why they're vanishing from urban areas and from their natural habitats that remain, such as the pine barrens. Pine barrens are now one of New Hampshire's rarest natural communities, partly because they are a great place to build upon. You don't need to worry about drainage because the soil is already dry. They tend to be relatively flat, and the trees that grow there are often valuable for a variety of other commercial uses. Historically, these pine barrens were much more prevalent, and the few areas of pine barrens that remain in the state are in the Ossipee area, although they are reduced, and in the lower Merrimack River Valley, which does include our capital city of Concord. They are unfortunately almost completely gone, but there is some untouched pine barrens habitat that's still holding on in there. One of them is actually right in the middle of the city of Concord and has been set aside for Karner blue butterfly conservation. As I mentioned, a lot of our major cities have now been built on top of former pine barrens habitat. But for a little while, some of those urban areas actually became a source of artificial breeding habitat for common nighthawks in the form of gravel rooftops. And this was first documented, common nighthawks utilizing flat gravel-covered rooftops as a nesting area as early as 1915. That might seem like an odd choice for common nighthawks to switch from their natural habitat to breeding on gravel rooftops in the middle of cities. But they do strongly resemble some of their natural habitats, particularly the cobble barrens that we still have a little bit of up in the White Mountains and north of the mountains. Food availability in the cities is also not too bad, particularly when you consider how much insects concentrate around artificial light sources. So, urban habitats are not a terrible place to be if you are a common nighthawk. But unfortunately, even that urban habitat is decreasing because gravel rooftops are being replaced with black rubber rooftops. And there are a variety of drawbacks to those black rubber rooftops, including increased solar exposure, but also increased exposure to predators. These nighthawks are not nearly as well camouflaged on a black rubber roof compared to a pea stone gravel covered roof. And then also, you get a much higher temperature on those rubber roofs due to their coloration as well as their direct exposure to the sun. So, in the early and mid 2000s, the then fledgling Project Nighthawk began to wonder, to what extent is the decline of common nighthawks in New Hampshire due to the loss of nesting habitats, especially in the form of these gravel rooftops? If so, what could we do to restore some of that nesting habitat in urban areas? And if we are able to do some habitat restoration on these rooftops, will common nighthawks utilize this new kind of human-created habitat within our own cities? And this is where gravel nest patches enter into the scene. These gravel nest patches are roughly 9-foot by 9-foot square areas of pea stone gravel laid atop of an existing roof substrate. And they provide suitable nesting areas to replace previously available gravel roofs or to entice nighthawks to repopulate an urban area that they were previously abundant in. It is worth noting that this gravel nest patch design was pioneered by Vincent Marzelli in Maine during the 1980s. So, having read the papers by Marzelli, we wanted to see if this model could also be successful in restoring common nighthawks to some of the urban areas that they had been vanishing from over the past several decades. To answer these questions, New Hampshire Audubon initiated Project Nighthawk in 2007. And we targeted two major cities, Concord, our capital, and Keene in the southwest corner of the state. We later expanded, placing nest patches in Claremont, Hanover, and Woodsville, all of which are located along the Connecticut River Valley. And our objective was to determine if these nest patches could reverse the decline of common nighthawks in these specific urban areas. These nest patches are built through a series of pretty basic steps, the first being site evaluation. In order to place a gravel nest patch anywhere, you need to have a willing landowner. The roof needs to be flat. It should preferably have parapets if possible. There should be some structural formations on the roof to provide a little bit of shade. And the ideal orientation of the nest patch placement on the roof would be facing the south or southeast. The roof structure could have a variety of different substrates, but in particular, the substrate needs to essentially prevent the gravel from completely washing away, even when it is inside of that frame. And it needs to be capable of supporting the extra weight of the gravel over that particular section of the roof. Once you have an identified a suitable roof and you've made mutually agreed upon arrangements with the landowner, then you need a lot of gravel. We found that about 12 to 15 5-gallon buckets full of pea stone gravel is adequate to make one single nest patch. For some roofs, especially those that are covered in very smooth black rubber or that might have a very slight cant to them, could benefit from a frame to keep the gravel contained. And this frame can be pretty easily built out of 2x4s, possibly with some little scrap pieces of wood or plywood to secure the corners. The frame of the nest patch is then lined with a rubber membrane, or if a frame is not being used, you can place the membrane flat on the roof. And this is to help prevent water from flowing into the patch so that the gravel can remain dry. And there is a way to provide drainage so that any rainfall that does hit the gravel patch can escape without allowing additional water to flow into the patch. Finally, all that's left to do is place the frame where you want it and spread out that gravel. This can take a fair bit of work, schlepping all of those buckets up to a roof, especially if there isn't an elevator that goes all the way to the top floor. But hey, it's great for fitness if you're into that kind of thing. Once the gravel has been dumped out of the buckets, just using a steel rake to spread the gravel evenly is all you need to finish up your nest patch. And these are some examples of some finished gravel nest patches created by Project Nighthawk in the late 2000s and early 2010s. So this first example on the left has a standard frame with the rubber membrane, and the second one shows a patch that does not have a frame, but where some sandbags were carefully placed on a slightly sloping edge to prevent gravel migration. There were some instances where the landowners were especially enthusiastic about the project and allowed us to place more than one patch on the roof, including this rooftop that was already covered in river-washed stone, which is too large to be truly suitable for nighthawk nesting activity, but did make a great substrate for us to spread the pea stone gravel on top. And we also tried adding these little shade providing structures that were just made very simply out of a collection of bricks, a piece of plywood, and then a couple of additional bricks on top to prevent the plywood from sliding out of place. Once these nest patches were in place, our next order of business was to keep an eye out for nighthawk activity in the areas where the nest patches were placed. So at regular weekly intervals during the breeding season, which lasts from late May, early June through August, a team of absolutely outstanding, dedicated volunteers, at the time, myself included, monitored these gravel nest patch sites for common nighthawk activity. And we also kept an eye on sites where common nighthawks were observed, even if there was not a gravel nest patch there. And during this monitoring, our team was on the lookout for repeated sightings of common nighthawks over a potential nest area, sounds of the male's display, the painting and circling overhead during the evening and very early morning hours. We also kept a really close ear out for the booming display that the males do, and we got especially excited if they boomed over a place where we knew there was a gravel patch. And when we had roof access, which was easy if we already had a nest patch placed, could be a little more challenging in some other areas, we also performed visual searches for the nests. Unfortunately, despite all of this effort and well thought out plan, we did not ever have any nesting activity on the gravel roof patches, and we were very disappointed, particularly given that other researchers such as Marzelli had such good luck with them in the 80s. We did, however, have males booming over several nest patches. So it's not really clear to us why, if males found that spot suitable, they were unable to recruit a mate to those areas. In Concord, between the years of 2007 until last breeding season, we had an average of 5 males on territory, with an average of 3 confirmed or probable nests, but none of them were on the nest patches that we placed on roofs. In Keene, we had an average of 1 confirmed or probable nest annually between 2007 and 2020, with an average of 3 males on territory in that same time frame. There's actually a typo on the slide. My apologies. That average of 3 males on territory in Keene should read 2007 through 2020 as well. Unfortunately, we have observed no activity associated with nesting in Keene since the year 2020. Despite placing gravel nest patches in the upper Connecticut River Valley, we had no nighthawk reports in the Hanover area where those patches were placed. However, we did catch wind of a couple of similar programs that were going on at roughly the same time as ours, completely unbeknownst to us. A similar program in Maine did report some use of patches. So they do appear to be effective in some areas, but for some reason, not so much in New Hampshire. There was also a similar program to ours that was run in Pennsylvania. And one thing that we found particularly interesting from their data is that they noted very high rates of predation in their rooftop nests. So one of the things that we wondered is whether that 9-foot by 9-foot patch might be too visible or provide too much of a visual cue for predators, who would then have an easier time finding the common nighthawk nest in a smaller 9 by 9 square foot area versus an entire gravel covered rooftop. So these results were certainly not what we hoped for, but there were still informed actions that we were able to take from what we learned. We have continued monitoring efforts from 2007 all the way up to today. They're still ongoing in an effort to better understand the breeding behavior of these incredible birds. We search for nests on any rooftop with a booming male nighthawk so long as we have roof access, which can be tricky sometimes. A lot of landowners do get pretty hung up on the liability of having some crazy biologist romping around on their roof, even though we assure them that we're not as crazy as we look. But such is life. Whenever we do have access to a nest area, we check for predation whenever possible, including during our routine monitoring, even if it's from a distance. But this really begged the question for us. If the Nighthawks aren't using the nest patches that we put out, where are they? It turns out that some of them aren't on rooftops at all. So I want to tell you a story about a nest area that has particular significance both for me personally and for the project. It was such a cool scenario. So, our first documented nighthawk nest in Concord in modern times was found in 2007. And it was not on a gravel roof patch. It was not on a roof at all. It was on bare ground at a concrete casting company, of all places. And you can't see the female very well from the big picture. Again, she is so well camouflaged, but she is in fact there. And that zoomed in picture was taken from a slightly different angle. Luckily for us at this concrete casting company, the landowners were absolutely fascinated by this charismatic little mom and her mate that would display vigorously at night. And they were very happy to allow us access to their property so that we could monitor this Nighthawk family's process. I was at New Hampshire Audubon as just a volunteer in 2007 when we first got the call that a nighthawk had been observed displaying over this property. I was only 18 at the time. I was getting ready to go off to college, and I was able to go with the then coordinator and founder of Project Nighthawk, Becky Suamala, to see if we could find any evidence of nesting on this property. And it was here that I came within inches of stepping on the nest. And it was initially so horrifying. I just froze in place with literally 1 foot up in the air, staring at the ground. And then we just were so excited that we actually had a nest and that the young eventually hatched from that nest. So we kept a very close eye on this nest, and we knew roughly when the chick hatched. In this photo, it is only about 2 to 4 days old. We estimated hatch date on July 30th, which is quite late for a common nighthawk. Usually they will lay their eggs in around mid-June, early mid-June. So we suspect that this particular nest might have been the result of a previous nest failure and a reattempt at this new location. At 2 days old, this chick has already doubled its weight from the day that it hatched. And pin feathers start to appear at around 5 and 6 days old. You can see them right there on the chick's wings and on its back. And we continue to watch as this chick grew, developed more feathers, and it was quite mobile. It could scuttle to find shelter if it was approached, so we kept our distance. And then this bird, common nighthawks will typically fledge between 18 and 23 days. And we estimate that the bird was 21 or 22 days old on the very last day that we saw it in the immediate vicinity of the nest. And at this point, we had already witnessed it doing some test flights. So we hope and inferred that it fledged successfully and hopefully had a successful first fall migration. Luckily for us, this pair of nesting nighthawks returned again in 2008, and this time they raised 2 chicks in roughly the same location. This time, the eggs were laid on June 1st, which is much more expected, and they hatched on June 22nd. And being able to follow this family from egg laying all the way through chick fledging was a remarkable opportunity for us to observe the full spectrum of their nesting, chick rearing, and fledging behavior. What really surprised us this year is just how mobile those chicks were. So I know it's a little bit pixelated and hard to read, but the little text bubble and arrow on the far left side of the screen is where the original nest was. Nest, where there was a little scrape in the ground and 2 eggs were laid. But then that far distant marker is where we later found the chicks in early July. They moved over 400 feet from their original nest site, which for a bird with teeny tiny legs was pretty impressive. And Mom, when we checked on the chicks, especially when we panicked not seeing them in their original spot and had to go searching for them 400 feet away, Mom was appropriately protective of the nest. And this was one of our first opportunities to directly observe that nest defense and decoy behavior that the females do when you're getting a little too close to their offspring. What was really incredible is that the oldest chick that hatched just a little bit before the younger one took its first flight at 17 days old, and it was last seen only 2 days after that first flight. And so we assume the best, that it fledged successfully. But the younger chick stuck around for 40 days and was last seen on July 31st. And it was really thanks to one of our stellar volunteers, Stephanie, with these great observations of post-fledging behavior that really is seldom seen in this species. And once again, in 2009, the pair returned to the very same area, but the nest met a tragic end. The eggs were laid on June 8th, and they were incubating, and everything seemed to be going great despite cooler, wetter spring weather. But then, following a very severe storm with heavy downpours in early July, the nest unfortunately failed due to flooding of the nest area. And the chicks had only just barely hatched, so they were not able to move to higher ground. So it was a fascinating story for the 3 years, well, almost 3 full years that we were able to observe this pair at this nest area. We suspect that they ended up moving to a different nest area after their nest flooded in 2009, but unfortunately we were not able to relocate them definitively. So, Project Nighthawk continues to this day. We do continue to monitor the sites where we placed those gravel rooftop nest patches, although we continue to not confirm that there are any nests on those gravel patches. We instead tend to focus on areas where the behavior of the birds, the display of the male, and sightings of the female indicate that there is likely an active nest on non-patch sites. Whenever we can get access to a rooftop, we monitor for nest success and predation events. And in the future, we would love to be able to place game cameras near nest sites so that we can monitor directly to get even more insight into both the behavior of the adults, the chicks, and try to document some predation events to get a handle on who the culprits are. in the most common predation areas. And we are starting to evaluate the feasibility for a collaborative movement ecology study with some partners in Maine and possibly beyond. And this would involve some radio telemetry via the MODIS Wildlife Tracking Network. So that is the story of Project Nighthawk. The success of Project Nighthawk has been made possible by the absolutely outstanding crew of volunteers, especially those in the Concord and Ossipee areas. These volunteers have helped us over the years with nest patch construction, monitoring surveys, including in some of the most mosquito-rich habitats I have ever had the dubious pleasure of existing in. Photo documentation whenever we have access to a nest area. Public engagement, because especially in urban areas, people inevitably wonder why we're lurking around with binoculars on so many evenings. The creation and maintenance of the Project Nighthawk website and the content for it, and administrative support, particularly data collation and entry. We also owe much to the Ashwelot Valley Environmental Observatory in Keene and to Ken Clapper, a former and successful master's student from Antioch University in Keene, for their support, especially with the nest patch experiment in Keene. And to Lou Ann Conroy, who was instrumental in helping us to install, maintain, and monitor the nest patches in the Hanover and Lebanon areas of New Hampshire. And on that note, thank you again for being here with us this evening. And if you have any questions, I am happy to answer those at this time. Thank you.
Amazing. Big round of applause for Lindsay. Thank you
Virtual
so much for
applause.
sharing.
My pleasure. It was wonderful to be here with you folks this evening. I'd love to be able to actually see you all on Zoom now, so I'm going to end the slideshow.
So yeah, if folks have questions, go ahead and slap those in the chat here. I don't see any in there just yet,
That's
so
okay.
I'll go ahead and get the ball rolling with a question that I have. Have you looked at in these urban areas where you do have confirmed activity with these
Mhm.
nighthawks potentially nesting or even confirmed nesting?
Yeah.
Have you looked at any of the other habitat, strong air quotes, factors within those urban areas that might affect why they might choose certain gravel areas or not? Is everything from just like I don't know, does that neighborhood seem to have more trees or something?
Mhm.
Any other of those kind of habitat with very strong air quote features or just better
Totally.
lighting, you know?
Right. Right. So, all that I can really say to that is that at this point, we have so few confirmed nests in the state of New Hampshire, and they are so difficult to locate for truly direct observation that it's difficult to make that kind of assessment. But a lot of the activity that we are observing in the Concord area is on areas that were built directly over the Pine Barrens. I don't know what that means. I don't know if we have a way to tell what that means, but it is pretty fascinating to see that even though they've got the whole city really at their disposal, because even though gravel rooftops aren't as common, there are still a lot of flat rooftops and there are plenty of nest patches around. They still tend to concentrate around the residual pine barrens habitat that I mentioned was set aside for Karner blue butterfly conservation. But the Karner blue easement area is not undergoing prescribed burns, which would ordinarily happen naturally in completely unmanaged pine barrens habitat. And so it itself has started to grow up. So there are a ton of whippoorwills breeding very successfully in that little patch of pine barrens. but there are no common nighthawks nesting in those barrens themselves because now we have too much of a mid-story for them.
Oh, that's fascinating. It's sort of nightjar ecological succession, I guess.
I thought the same thing. And we can see that also in the Ossipee pine barrens, which are managed by the Nature Conservancy. So they do some controlled burns on a rotational basis in the sections of pine barrens that they oversee. And you can tell when there was a recent burn, even if you don't know about it directly, because there are more nighthawks there. And you can especially tell if the fire started to get just a little bit out of hand because the nighthawks prefer those areas quite strongly. And then as the whips move in, the nighthawks move out, not because of direct competition, but because of slightly different habitat preferences. It's a very cool little system.
We've got a couple questions here from Grace. Grace, would you like to just go ahead and unmute and ask your question directly?
That'd be great. I've got a couple of questions for you. Um,
Sure.
I am a early career biologist, really interested in urban ecology and movement ecology. And you
Ooh,
had
nice.
mentioned that you might have been doing some work, collaboration in Maine with movement ecology. And I was just curious, who exactly is doing movement ecology in Maine?
Yeah. So nothing has, well, correction. There are some folks in Maine that have put some low tech tags on whippoorwills and a small handful of common nighthawks. I'm not sure if they are currently doing the work, but they are, of course, now the place where this individual works is completely escaping my mind. The name of the researcher is Logan Parker. And Logan and I have connected through the Global Nightjar Network. And if this type of work is of interest to you, Grace, we should probably talk and I can rope you into the network if you have an interest in working with caprimulgids. We're always on the lookout for folks who want to join us in our zany adventures.
Would be
So
fabulous.
so Logan operates in Maine, and one other question that has been on my mind that would really help to work directly with Logan on is to what extent the breeding population of nighthawks at the Freiburg airport, just over the border near the Ossipee Pine Barrens in Maine, how connected is that breeding population with our Ossipee breeding population? Is Freiburg Airport a better place for them and we receive their overflow? Is it vice versa? That's a question that I would like to answer. We just need some grant money to make it happen. And similarly with the movement ecology work, because we have relatively few nighthawks remaining in New Hampshire as far as a breeding population goes, if we were to do anything appreciable with movement ecology, we would really need to partner with someone. And since Logan has already done a little bit of this work and he's in an adjacent state, it would make sense for us to hopefully team up and do this. So at this point, it's all talk and not a whole lot of action. We need to survive this field season and put our heads together and hopefully co-author some grants. But because common nighthawks have such a broad range, it doesn't hurt to include more areas in movement ecology work. And there's been a big push lately among a variety of ornithological circles, particularly those that intersect with Partners in Flight, to do range wide movement ecology studies. One such effort, the fieldwork just wrapped up in 2025, and the focus was wood thrush. And I did a chunk of the field work for New Hampshire's contribution to that study. So there's a precedence. It's just a big undertaking with a whole lot of coordination that generates a whole lot of data. And it's all very exciting, but we need to make sure we have our ducks in a row before we can actually do the thing, or our nighthawks in a row, as the case may be.
Awesome. Thank you. This is really interesting.
I'm so glad that you asked, Grace, and feel free to snag my email address off of the cover slide if you haven't already, and shoot me a message, and we'll talk
Awesome.
more. My
Thanks.
pleasure.
Um,
Yeah,
I do also have a couple more questions.
go for it.
Um, a week feels like pretty fast for pin feather development. I've worked
It
with
is.
different species before,
Mhm.
and it's like, oh, it'll be like a week and a half or something.
Mhm.
Is that kind of just like with, is that kind of pin feather development just kind of required for how fast they're just fledging?
Yes, that is what I suspect. Nighthawks, because they're ground nesters and they really don't even use a particularly sheltered area as their nest, it makes sense that there would be an evolutionary pressure for them to fledge quickly. And a big portion of that is, of course, feather growth and development. And so I strongly suspect that that is why we start seeing pin feathers after only about a week on these guys, and why they fledge after roughly 3 weeks on average.
Cool. Is this kind of like super fast development very typical for like night chars, or is this kind of a specific thing to
Hmm.
nighthawks?
That is an excellent question. And I don't know the answer off the top of my head, but I would suspect that for any ground nesting nightjar, and the vast majority of them are ground nesters worldwide, this is not a behavior unique to common nighthawks by any means. I suspect that they would follow comparable timelines, although generally speaking, the larger bodied the bird, the slightly longer it will take for them to develop to the point of fledge.
Very cool. And then just one more question is how often would you check for nests?
As often as I can, given that I coordinate 5 other projects in addition to Project Nighthawk. Luckily, we do have that fantastic team of volunteers I mentioned, but they do vary in levels of skill and experience. Um, so the true nest searching isn't done by just anyone, if that makes sense. And then on top of that, places like the Ossipee Pine Barrens are, although publicly accessible, still protected areas, and it's frowned upon if you go tromping around off trail. So appropriate arrangements need to be made with landowners. The biggest challenge that we have in terms of nest searching is rooftop access. Um, I don't know if it's a New Hampshire thing or if I just don't look like a trustworthy individual for some reason, but we rarely get permission from landowners in urban areas to get up on their roofs. And that is a real bummer.
It's unfortunate.
Yeah. In an ideal world, at the start of the breeding season and a little bit later in June, around the time that I would expect early nest failures to possibly make a second attempt and renest, I would like to go out a minimum of once or twice a week. Unfortunately, I'm spread a little thin, and that's not always possible.
Good to know. Thanks.
Of course. Thanks for your questions.
Got a question from Leslie. If you'd like to unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, hi.
Hi, Leslie.
Yeah, I'm doing some of the Nighthawk monitoring in the Chicago area,
Awesome.
and I have seen Nighthawks at dusk. I'm not
Yep,
out at dawn usually. Um,
there.
but I've also done other BCN monitoring, Bird Conservation Network here,
Yep.
and early in the morning. And actually, Merlin has picked up nighthawks. I did not see or hear them, so I'm just
Mhm.
wondering, are vocalizations during daytime or early morning, are they common or not?
Not especially. It does happen occasionally, especially if you get a little too close to the center of a territory. I unfortunately would be a little bit suspicious of Merlin under those circumstances. That being
Hmm.
said, when I was just up in the Ossipee Pine Barrens yesterday, it was, what time was it? It was about 7:45, so still a good ways before sunset. And I was doing a nest search, ended up finding eggshells, and the male did actually yell at me from a perch. He did a couple of isolated, very emphatic peents. That is the first time that I personally have had a nighthawk be that vocal during, if not full daylight, then darn close, because the sun was still well up at that point. So is it possible? Yeah. Is it likely? No.
Yeah. Well, I certainly wouldn't report it if I didn't see it or hear it myself.
Good for
So I
you.
was just curious about trends or what's known about them. Thanks.
Of course. Happy to help. Great question.
And we have another question here from Christina. I don't know if she's able to come off mute at this point. No, okay, all right, cool. Well, Christina was asking that you noted that the preferred location for these gravel roof patches were to the south and or east side of the building.
Yep.
Why is that?
Sun exposure. Not that they're cold-blooded animals, but they do seem to like to bask somewhat, for lack of a better way to put it, earlier in the day. I do not know about the mechanism behind that, but it is something that we have observed. I would need to do a little bit of digging to see if anybody else knows any more. And with capromulgids, it's a bit of a crapshoot, pardon my language, about whether or not anyone would know anything specific about that peculiarity of theirs. But both in the Marzelli literature and in our personal observation, they tend to favor that side of rooftops. Of course, glad I could answer your question at least a little bit, Christina.
All right, last call. Any other questions? Adrian, can't unmute. Have you found any more evidence as to why population decline is steeper in the Northeast than in other areas?
Unfortunately not. This winter, I am planning to do another deep dive into both our data and any literature that may have come out in the past few years. If you hear a weird noise, I apologize. It is my toddler-sized cat screaming at me for treats. So just a heads up. And yes, he is indoor only, so he is, sir, he is not a risk to birds. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there because I'm being yelled at by my cat. Why the population decline is steeper in the Northeast. Outside of reforestation, I got nothing. I can't imagine that there's a greater tendency or volume of pesticide application up here compared to, say, the Midwest, the literal grain basket of the United States. So I think that that one can be ruled out, although it would be good to actually look into it and not just speculate. I don't know. I want to know. I hope to find out. But at this point, unfortunately, I got nothing else.
Really illuminates the fact that despite being common, quote unquote, they're still very mysterious birds in a lot of ways. There's a lot of open-ended questions out there.
Absolutely.
Might seem like an odd spot to end on a program, but maybe I think is an optimistic way to end a program, especially when we segue into all of these programs, including your local Chicago Nighthawk project, are volunteer-run programs. So whether you're joining us from the Chicagoland area somewhere, or potentially from the Northeast or another part of the country, you know, all of these efforts are heavily driven and supported by volunteers going out there to keep track of these birds. And even if it's not a formal project, even just when you see any of these birds, throw in an eBird, right?
Yep.
That is information and data that's used by researchers all around the country and the world. So there you go. That's my plug both for folks in the North New Hampshire area. Reach out to Lindsay, volunteer. If you're in the Chicago area, our project is done for the summer, but please go ahead and go back to that website there, chicagobird.org, and look at volunteering for us next year. Help us track these birds across the city and the region, and help us start to illuminate some of the answers to those questions that we were asking here this evening. But with that said, please enjoy the rest of your evening. Be safe. Don't inhale too much smoke. And again, a big round of applause and thank you to Lindsay for spending her evening with us here and sharing her knowledge and experiences. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.